Hi, I'm Marcio. I'm Solutions Engineer here at GitHub. I work close to customers here in the EMEA region to help them get the most out of GitHub. And this is a series of video to talk a bit more about security at GitHub Enterprise. So I'm going to go through the concepts of SAML SSO, user provisioning, and enterprise managed users. So the idea is to give customers the full understanding and how to use each of them and how they relate to securing your GitHub Enterprise account. If you have any questions at all, reach your account manager, and the solutions engineer team is going to be happy to support you and all the questions you have if this video is not enough to reply to them. It's a series of 3 videos, so this is starting with SAML SSO basically integration, and then we're going to talk a bit more about the skin in the second video, and then a third about enterprise managed users. Great, so let's get started. So security at GitHub Enterprise starts with the discussion what we are protecting here. GitHub is the home of more than 73 millions of developers and contributors to the open source that have a personal account, and they use this personal account to contribute back to GitHub. When we're talking about corporate space, we have this concept of this entity which is called an enterprise account, which enterprise account holds another entity which is the organization. An organization is a way of sharing multiple projects across developers, and all these organizations' policies, auditing, and billing information can be managed from this enterprise account. Within the organization is where it leaves your code through the projects and repositories at GitHub, and this is the asset that we want to protect. So we want to protect your organizations, and by that we are going to create and going to discuss on this presentation mechanisms that we can achieve that. But all these discussions has to start first about talking about your business needs. As your company scales and your teams grow, controlling the access to your organizational resources may become harder and harder to manage with time. With that, you may want to understand better who has access to organizational resources, as only checking the GitHub user accounts, you might not know that Anakin86 actually is an employee of yours, and there is no tie actually with any system that belongs to you or any identity provider or an Active Directory. So the answer here that we're trying to find is who has access to my GitHub resources, to your GitHub resources. Beyond the discussion about access, and that's great, there is also the discussion on how to ensure proper onboarding and offboarding of your employees. So how, for example, you ensure that a bad liver does not become a threat to your business, or how do we onboard users as soon as possible. There is also the programmatic access to your resources. How can I have more visibility on that and make sure that those are authorized before they can be used over my organization. Now it's your turn to think a bit, how is your onboarding process today? So how is that going? What are the steps that your team has to perform to remove access once an employee leaves your company? What challenges you're facing there, right? And what issues have you had when you're not able to do that on the proper time? So let's talk about SAML SSO, which is the feature behind some improved capabilities on account security. So SAML basically is a standard. In a general fashion, it's a standard for exchanging authentication and authorization data between parties. Especially here we introduce the concept of identity provider and a service provider. And I'm going here to explore more the concept of SAML and SSO within GitHub Enterprise Account and organization. So SAML SSO actually is going to give organization owners and enterprise owners a way to control and secure access to the organization resources. So that means the repository, issues, and pull requests. SAML SSO actually is going to link our GitHub user account to an external identity provider. So here's the first caveat when we're talking about SAML SSO and GitHub. And that link actually means something else. It really means that when the user is going to log in to access the resource within your organization, this user will have to log in against GitHub with their personal account and afterwards against your identity provider. So there are these 2 steps of signing in. So we talk about single sign-on, but it's really like a double single sign-on because these 2 accounts have to be logged in. So first against GitHub and then against your identity provider. And we are going to go into details on that. I'm going to show a demo and then we're going to go to workflow. So I believe that's going to be clear. So the SAML SSO focuses really on the authentication part. So it's part that we're going to reply to these questions. So does this user should have access to my code? And if there are personal access tokens, how to authorize them to perform a REST API request. Moving forward to discuss the feature overview and try to reply to this question. So SAML SSO is key to secure a GitHub Enterprise account. So why is that? First, it's going to give control over who has access to GitHub organizations, and it's going to do that by ensuring that only the users that have an external identity, which means that your identity provider can have access to resources like code, repository, issues, pull requests that are living within your organization or enterprise account. Also, it's going to ensure that only authorized personal access tokens can be used to send REST API requests and retrieve data, which means no unauthorized access unless these personal access tokens are authorized by a user within your organization. So now let's take a look on a hands-on demo on how this login experience looks like to see it, how it works when SAML SSO is in place. So let's take a look on this environment that was prepared for the demo. I'm using this organization here on the top. My identity provider is an Azure AD instance deployed in the cloud. I'm using SAML SSO is already set up, so this configuration is already done. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to log in a user that belongs to this organization, and I'm going to try some when I'm trying to access to some private and internal repositories. So let's get going with that. So here on my left side, I have an organization at GitHub, and on my right side, I have my Azure instance where my Active Directory is already set up. So I can browse in this Active Directory, I can take a look at my users, and these users are already set up. They have been created in my Azure AD, and I have already linked them. So actually, if I try to access some resources that are public without a GitHub account, I can do that. But what I'm going to do now, I'm going to sign in with this user, and I'm going to see then what are the resources that I can access. So here first I can just put my username and password, and actually asking for my to enter my two-factor authentication code. So I'm going just to grab this code here in my email and put there. And now the second step is to sign on against my identity provider, which is in this case it's Azure. So you see I redirect to my Azure AD authentication signing portal. I just enter my email address, then I'm going to input my password. And after having this choice to stay signed in or not, I'm able to see more resources than previously when I didn't have logged in the account. So I can see these private resources, and if I browse a bit, there are some internal folders here now. So all these that I was not able to access before I have, and I can even take a look at the people here on my repository and also the teams. So this process that you just have seen is a process that happens when there is a user that belongs to this identity provider. So it is a member of that organization. However, we have other scenarios, for example, when the user is an outside collaborator. So I just would like to go through this workflow, which covers different scenarios, and we can then take a look in depth on how it works for different cases. And the main difference between them with regards to SAML SSO integration is that outside collaborators, they are not going to go through your identity provider, so they don't have an identity linked to your IDP ultimately. So if you go through this process, this workflow, we can see that here we have a user that's attempting to access private resource, like private content. And this first thing that we're going to check is this user actually logged in to a GitHub account? If no, that's the first thing that we're going to ask. So the user has to log in first. In this case, we verify also if the user is a full member of that GitHub organization. If the user is a full member of the organization and this SAML SSO is in place, then you redirect the user to your identity provider. And if this process goes as it should, everything's good. If the user is an outside collaborator, it's not a member, so then there is no actually this step. And then there is no SAML SSO and the user has access directly to the resources of your organization. And the last scenario is if the user actually has to access some resources and the user is not a member. So actually the user is going to receive a 404 in that case. Another important aspect to understand is what is the workflow about inviting a user once I have my SAML SSO configuration in place. So before we start and take a look at this workflow, I just would like to highlight that actually there are two ways to provision a user. So first is a manual way and other is via scheme, which is handled in another video. In this one, let's suppose that we're manually adding this user to organization, and then the user is going to receive an invitation to join this organization. The user is then checked if there is an existing, and if the user is logged into an existing github.com account. If not, the user is going to have to create this new account. The second scenario is like the user has this account and is logged in, then it's fine. It's going to be redirected to the IDP. And the case in the middle is actually if no, but user has an account, so the user has to do this login process before. So that's just to highlight these three scenarios. But ultimately, it's going to land on the IDP page if everything goes all right. And then at the identity provider login, there is the procedure of authentication. That if that's successful, it's going to provision this user with automatically setting the user's profile based on the SAML response with the UPN and name ID. And ultimately, the user is granted access to the GitHub Enterprise application and has the SAML identity already linked to access this organization. And of course, if there is an error in the process, that's supported. It's important to notice here that this process of inviting a user, that means provisioning a user to this organization, it's not really creating an account. At the end, what's happening here is just a linking between an existing GitHub user account and one account and one identity that exists at your identity provider. And that's all supported by SAML. Okay, great. So now that we have already an overview of how logging in and how user provisioning works, let's take a look on how enabling SAML SSO works. So this is the view of my organization here at GitHub, which is called Octodemo. And in this organization, I can set up my policies, my security settings. I can see my billing settings. I can see also all the organizations within this enterprise account. But I want to take a look on the settings and especially regarding authentication security. So let's dig at that. I go to authentication security here on the left side. And what you can see here is that I have this SAML single sign-on interface where I can require a SAML authentication. And what does it mean to require SAML authentication? Actually, it means that I am enforcing that all these users that belong to this enterprise account across all these organizations, these users, they will have to make a link between your identity provider and their GitHub account on the next time they log in. They will be notified about that, and they will not be able to access any resources if they don't do this process before. So there is another way also to activate it, SAML single sign-on, that allows you actually to go through two different steps, which is doing this at the organization level. So if I go to my one organization here, so let's leave this site. I'm going to look for my organization here. So let's take a look at this one. Click on it. And I go straight to settings, and I'll have the same authentication security options here, but now at the organization level. And what I can see here is that it's already enabled. I actually already have done that configuration, but I can do that in two different steps. I can do that in first enabling it, which means that the users have the optionally, they're going to be notified with a banner once it's enabled. And then after I can enforce it. So I can do that in two steps. So actually there is going not to be a notification by email, but the user is going to see this banner once they log in. So let's take a look at this banner. As you can see, the banner appears on the top of the organization, and it notifies that their single sign-on has been enabled for this organization, and it prompts the user to go ahead and click on authenticate your account. When the user goes ahead and click on authenticate your account, the user is going to be redirected to your identity provider single sign-on page. And once the user has successfully signing against your identity provider, the link between the GitHub user account and your identity provider is going to be done. Now let's go back and let's take a look on the second step, which would be requiring SAML authentication. So once I click here on require, it means that all the members that belong to this organization, they're going to be removed from this organization if they haven't linked their identity provider entity yet. These users will have like 90 days to be reinstated back. They're going to be notified by that. And once they have performed this linking process, they are going to be able to have the same rights that they had before. We also recommend more doing all this configuration at the organization level, because if you're at Azure AD and Okta today, you also can have like team synchronization and user provision via skin, which is quite useful for automation. Another important aspect of securing GitHub Enterprise is about securing our personal access tokens usage. So when we talk about programmatic access today at GitHub, we have to talk about personal access tokens. So personal access tokens are tokens, keys that are generated, and they belong to users that are part of your organization. And those users, once SAML SSO is in place, they have actually to authorize those personal access tokens, so they're still working as they were working previously. So if I go here to my github.com dashboard, I go here on the top and I click on my profile picture. I'm going to take a look on my my settings. I'm going to go down here on my settings, and let's take a look at developer settings, where the personal access tokens management live, and I'm going to take a look on the classic ones. So here I can take a look on all these classic personal access tokens that I have. And if you see here, you have this column which has configure SSO for each of these tokens. So if I take a look at this org underline token, take a look at that, I can see it was last used like within last 2 months. So let's say I want to keep the usage of this personal access token now that the SSO is enabled, and then let's say for scene enforcement. So I click on configure SSO and I go to authorize. And once I click authorize, you can see here that I have here the list of organizations I have to authorize for this one. Once I click on authorize, I'm going to be prompted to single sign-on against this organization. Once I do this step and then authorize these credentials to access my organization, I ensure that I can continue using it as I was using it previously, even after SAML SSO is enforced. So now you might be interested in asking question, okay, so how do I actually roll out that within my enterprise account within my organizations? Is there a plan for that? How can we, which steps should we follow? So that's why we devised like this rollout plan. And you can find the link for the complete rollout plan here in the description. So the first thing is favor handling some SSO integration at the organization level instead of enterprise. So for 2 reasons. First, it gives flexibility, so we can first enable and afterwards enforce. And also for Azure AD and Okta users, you have also the possibility of enabling skin, which is user provisioning and team synchronization. The next step would be to try it in a test organization, to try it out and try to understand how it works. Next step would be to audit, and that means to understand better what is your environment, what you're expecting of SAML SSO. So to know what are your personal access tokens, how you're using it, which integrations you're using it. Also, if there are outside collaborators, maybe we would like them to be part of our IDP, so how to explore this option in your identity provider. So just as a reminder, outside collaborators, they live outside your identity provider, and they wouldn't need to do the SAML single sign-on to access your resources. Then once you enable it, let's say you enable SAML SSO, communicate that and audit for adoption. Check how is the adoption going, how many users are enabling, how is this process going within your company. So you can track how is this process and maybe communicate further and try to reach a different means so you can achieve the higher adoption possible at this stage. Then we start thinking, okay, my adoption is good. I believe we have covered my pets, I have covered my personal access tokens, I have covered everything that's important for me. So you might be thinking about enforcing. So go ahead and go through this process, enforce it, and then communicate again. And lastly, ensure that personal access tokens and SSH keys are authorized. Now moving forward and talking about support. In practical terms, SAML SSO is going to work with basically any identity provider that implements SAML 2.0. We have some that we did test and we support 100%, and they're mentioned in our documentation page. You can find these links on the description down here. And here it is the summary of the identity providers with 100% support. So now the discussion about the limitations, what cannot really be achieved, or to clarify. So actually the user account is not provision as per se. So there is this link between a GitHub user account and the identity or identity provider. There's also you're not really able to customize user attributes when populating data into GitHub user account. That's valid when we are talking about GitHub Enterprise Cloud, which is a SaaS version of GitHub. If you're using GitHub Enterprise Server, there are some customization that can be done on the SAML data. Now to wrap up this video, I'm going to go through some frequently asked questions from our customers. And there is a typo in my slide, but let's go ahead with that. So the first question is about setting up SAML SSO at the enterprise account or for each organization. So as we touched briefly, better to do that at the organization level, especially if you are at Azure AD or Okta. It is going to enable you skin and are also team synchronization further on. Outside collaborators, the second question, so if they're affected or not. So they live outside the SAML SSO implementation, so they're not going to go through this process. So they're not going to be affected. What are the options for handling bots and service accounts when you have like bots or service accounts that have some personal access tokens associated to them? So the best is to have them handled by your IDP. So you have these accounts there and you have them with SAML SSO enabled. It's not, while it's technically possible, it's not the best practice to have them as outside collaborators. About best practice and recommendations on rolling out, there is a documentation that's very complete here in the description, but if you have questions, you can still reach your account management team. And last is what happens to personal access token of an user that has their SAML identity revoked. So once this user is removed from this organization, actually the personal access token is not going to be able to access resources of that organization anymore. Another best practice that is worth mentioning is to encourage the members of your organization to have personal access tokens that expire, so that have an expiration date associated to them, and also to use the same practice for your bots and the service accounts. That's it. Thanks a lot. And if you have any questions, reach out to your account manager. Thanks.